Okay, so next up, we have Zijun, is it? And Steph will help you set up. So I'll just introduce the paper. So this is Green Innovation and Voluntary Carbon Disclosure, which also sounds really interesting. And this looks like a Victoria University of Wellington author team. So we're having good representation from Vic today, so that's awesome. And you will have about 30 minutes. I will put a timer on so you can see as we come down.
Right. Hi, everyone. It's so glad to have the opportunity to present our current study today. So the research topic I'm going to present today is about green innovation and voluntary carbon disclosure. So it is a co-work with Griffin, Hai, and Elan, and they are my supervisors as well. So by focusing on the public firms in the United States, we investigate whether green innovation, especially green patents, could affect the voluntary carbon disclosure decisions for corporations. So let's move to the motivation part first. We know that information, especially accurate and sufficient information, is critical for the financial market efficiency. It is particularly a case when it comes to the urgent target of reducing CO2 emissions and to prevent the negative impact of climate change. Well, for individual companies, this negative impact includes the carbon transition risk, which is uncertainty in policy or technological innovation aspect when transferring to a low carbon economy. Well, in the context of carbon transition risk, an important consideration is how can we assess this risk if the emissions, the firm level carbon emissions is not observed to us. Well, so consistent with this point of view, investors and different kind of stakeholders have increasingly demanded for carbon disclosure by individual companies. Well, despite the demand for carbon disclosure, there many firms are still reluctant to provide such information to their CO2 emissions, especially voluntarily. Well, so in this research, we try to find out the determinant of carbon disclosure for individual companies. So many existing studies and commentators spot that carbon disclosure is necessary in the context of climate change and transition risk. So the point of view is no matter it's voluntary or mandatory disclosure, one would expect that disclosing more information could reduce the uncertainty about emissions and transition risk. So it would be easier for us to assess how far a company has to go in terms of reducing CO2 emissions and transferring to a low carbon economy. Well, for example, the Michael Bloomberg, the first chairman of TCFD, also stated that without reliable climate-related financial information, the market cannot price climate-related risks and opportunities correctly. So it further confirmed the importance of carbon disclosure. Well, in this research, we are going to focus on the voluntary disclosure decision because that is more prevalent around the world, and also because we focus on the firms in the United States, and there are no specific mandatory carbon disclosure regulation right now. So when it comes to the voluntary carbon disclosure, it gives discretion to the company. They can decide whether to disclose or not by themselves. So carbon disclosure is actually related to firms' incentives to disclose. It's kind of signaling. So the companies are more likely to disclose when they have positive news on it. Well, on the other side, Carbon disclosure is a non-financial disclosure, which means it could be motivated by firms' desire to act in a socially responsible manner. For example, if the firms have positive news on emissions, by disclosing this positive news on emissions, the firms could try to build up a better social image like that. So by considering these factors, we can summarize the benefits of voluntary carbon disclosure from two aspects. One is about informational. So by disclosing the firm level emissions, the companies could try to signal their carbon risk adaptation and reduce the uncertainty and firms' cost of capital as well. That is the first aspect of voluntary carbon disclosure. Well, another benefit is about reputational. As I just mentioned, carbon disclosure could help to preserve firms' reputation or their social trust, and therefore improve their long-term relationship with stakeholders as well, as suggested by some existing studies. So that are the two main benefits of voluntary carbon disclosure. Well, we know that disclosure always comes with a cost as well. So for the direct cost includes the processes of measuring and reporting emissions, and the indirect cost includes the preparatory cost, which means the companies might disclose or reveal some proprietary information which could be used by their competitors. So to sum up, the voluntary carbon disclosure involves the trade-off between the cost and benefit. So the companies would more likely to disclose when the benefits dominate the cost. So that is some basic series of voluntary disclosure. So by considering this basic series of voluntary disclosure, we want to examine whether green innovation, a useful tool to reduce emissions, could affect the voluntary disclosure decision. So the general idea is that green technologies, the green innovation, could mitigate or replace the existing CO2 emissions, and therefore they might be increase firms' incentives to disclose, because the companies have positive news on emissions. So they might want to tell the public that they are doing good on this. So that is a basic hypothesis of our study. So green technologies could facilitate voluntary carbon disclosure decision, because the improved environmental performance increase firms' incentives to disclose. And our research could also have some important implications. For example, it could be important for regulators and standard setters as they work towards incentivizing a firm to disclose their emissions. For example, if our results are solid, so the useful policies would be to support a firm to pursue green innovation activities, such as governmental subsidies. So, and therefore the companies would also be motivated to disclose their CO2 emissions as well. So that's our the main question and research question and implication of our study. So before we move to the research design, I want to explain the green technologies, the key factor of our study in more detail. So green technologies include the technologies that reduce emissions at the end pipe and also change to the production processes, such as the improved energy efficiency that could lead to a reduced environmental impact. Maybe I just move this. Yeah. It's better. Okay, so in this study, we actually use the patent data to identify green innovation, because scientists and engineers are responding to the climate change by developing more green patents. So as there are more and more green patents contribute to curbing CO2 emissions, we want to examine whether it can expand to affect the incentives for firms to disclose their emissions as well. So here it's an intuitive example about green patent. We just searched from the European Patent Office database. So here it shows a number to identify the specific patent. And it also provides a patent class to determine the relevant technology categories. Well, if we read the abstract, it provides the more detailed explanation about this green pattern. So it's here it's about removing carbon dioxide from a stream of airs or other gas. So it is clearly a green pattern technology. Well, in this paper, we actually use the pattern class to identify green patterns. And in particular, we use IPC green inventory to figure out the green pattern technology categories. So the IPC green inventory is developed by the IPC committee of experts. They sought out the pattern classes related to the environmentally sound technologies. So here it is a part of the IPC green inventory. So here you can say the technology categories are determined into detailed technology classes, and all of these technologies are matched to the IPC pattern classes. The IPC pattern class is a commonly used hierarchical pattern classification system. So we can use this to match with the pattern data and figure out the green patterns used in our test sample. So now we can move to the research design. It is a case that the studies on voluntary disclosure could exist an endogenous problem. So for our study, it is because firms do not randomly grant patents. So it might be associated with omitted variables that could drive the patenting activities and the carbon disclosure decisions simultaneously. So to address this concern, we exploit an instrument that could exogenously change a firm's green patenting activities. And therefore, we can apply this exogenous change in green patenting activities to find out the impact on disclosure decisions as well. So in particular, the specific IV we use is a shock to the US patent system induced by the Supreme Court decision on eBay versus Merck Exchange in 2006. So here it's I'm going to explain the background about this eBay case decision to help you understand why this case decision could lead to exogenous change in the patenting activities in the United States. So before the eBay case decision, the patent law provided strong power to the patent holders. So the patent holder or the plaintiff could automatically grant a permanent injunction if their patents were violated. So and at the same time, the defendant companies are forced to shut down the entire business related to the violated technologies, even if there is just a weak or unintentional violation, or the defendant companies need to negotiate a settlement with the plaintiff. However, both ways would be costly to the defendant company because the threats of permanent injunction provide strong bargaining power to the plaintiff during the negotiation. They can ask for lots of money that exceeding the actual patent value. And because of this strong bargaining power, there were increasing number of non-practicing entities were generating frivolous infringement claims to take advantage of defendant companies in the early 2000s. For example, the non-practicing entities could spend $2,000 to purchase a patent and use this to companies for patent violation. And so the main revenues of the non-practicing entities, NPEs, comes from their the patent settlements or licensing agreements. So sometimes the NPE is also called the patent trolls. And the patent settlements usually could be very expensive, like $100 million settlements. So clearly, this threat of permanent injunction accelerates the patent holdup problem and impedes innovation. In other words, the defendant companies could choose not to innovate anymore, do not generate any patents anymore to avoid this patent litigation risk, the costly patent litigation risk. So The eBay case decision actually changed this situation. As a result, the Supreme Court decided to end this permanent, automatically granting a permanent injunction, and instead allowing to decide on a case-by-case basis to debate whether an injunction was appropriate or not. So clearly, this the case decision increased the flexibility to debate the patent cases and therefore reduce the litigation risk and hold up a problem. So as a result, we can imagine this reduced litigation risk could increase firms' incentives to innovate. And this impact should be stronger for companies whose patents were frequently be accused before the case decision. So for example, the empirical study by Masnodi 2021, a management science paper found that companies that operate in area where the patent litigation is more intense increased their patenting activities more after the eBay case decision. So the reduced litigation risk could motivate firms to innovate. That is a basic idea rooted in this case decision. So we're gonna borrow this idea to conduct a natural experiment. So, and to find out the exogenous change in the firm's green patenting activities caused by this legal change that reduce the litigation risk. So the test design is to create a DID model. And generally, every firm that patenting in the United States would be affected by this legal change. And but the impact could be different across companies. So our experiment is actually examining the eBay's impact on the green patenting activities across the variation in the treatment intensity, which means we are comparing firms that are more affected by the legal change with the companies that are less affected by it. In other words, that is our equivalent to our treatment and control group. So I hope this regression model could provide a more intuitive explanation of our natural experiment. So the test design is to create a two-stage least square regression, where the first stage is the natural experiment. So exposure variable here, as I highlight here, it's a firm level variable to capture the patent litigation risk. And in other words, it's to determine whether a firm is more affected or less affected by the case decision. And I will explain how we compute these variables in the next slide. So here I just explain this equation first. Well, post is a dummy variable to determine whether a year is before or after the eBay case decision in 2006. And the most important variable in this equation is the interaction term between the post variable and the exposure variable. Well, as for the dependent variable, we use three different measures of green innovation, respectively, that are the number of green patents, the green patent citations, and the real market value of green patents. And each of them applied with a natural logarithm. Well, if we look at the equation, we also add industry fixed effects and, firm fixed effects and industry by year fixed effects. And in addition, for the robustness check, we also create a dummy exposure variable to create dummy exposure based on the sample medium to create a traditional DID model and just replicate this first stage regression based on the dummy exposure for the robustness check. Now I'm going to explain how we compute this exposure variable, So intuitively, a firm is more exposed to patent litigation risk if it operates in a technology area where the patent litigation is more intense. For example, in our test sample, we found that the patent lawsuits are more frequent in vehicle-related technologies. So we can imagine that the companies that patenting more in this technology area should be highly exposed to patent litigation risk. And therefore, after the eBay case decision, after the reduced litigation risk, this kind of firms should have stronger incentives to innovate, to generate green patents. So this idea is actually borrowed from Masnodi 2021 as well. And this equation here accounts for this idea. So based on this equation, it considers the probability of patent litigation activities, the PC. It's the probability of patent litigation activities in a technology area, and it also contains the share of patents the share of patents a firm I has in a specific patent class, if that is a green patent class especially. So the final exposure variable is a sum of the weighted average of litigation activities across all the green technology areas in which a firm operates. So a higher exposure score means the company is highly exposed to patent litigation risk. So that is a exposure variable, a firm level variable. And so we can use this variable to find out the predicted green patents from the first stage regression. And after that, we can move to the second stage. So we actually have two steps to construct the second stage regression. First, we use the predicted green patents to create the green patent stock by using the perpetual inventory method with a depreciation rate of 15% annually. So in other words, we accumulate the predicted green patents during the whole sample period. And that is because managing environmental problems usually depends on the company's current and past innovation, the green technologies. So like all the green technologies a firm has works together to reduce emissions. So that is why we accumulate green patents to create the predicted green patent stocks. So finally, we can regress the disclosure decision on the predicted green patent stocks. So disclosure is a dummy variable is to determine whether a firm has disclosed the scope 1 emissions in the following year or not. And we also control a bunch of control variables such as the firm size, the firm's profitability, productivity, and the R&D stock as well. So here it's a data and sample selection. Well, our final sample contains around 500 public firms in the United States with at least one green patent during the whole sample period. And the sample period starts in 2001 is consistent with Masnodi's test design in creating the litigation variable. And it ended in 2016 because of the patent data availability. Well, for the firm level emission data, we collected from the Thomson-Reuters data stream. And one thing important here is for the second stage regression, we only focus on the period after the legal change, the eBay case decision, which started in 2007. That is why our emission data has a shorter time period. We only want to capture the change, the increase in the patenting activities caused by the legal change. And also because the emissions, the emission disclosure have become more prevalent in recent few years, and the emission data is actually unavailable in 2001. So for this reason, these two main reasons, we use a shorter time period for the second stage regression just after the legal change in 2007. Besides, to determine the carbon disclosure decision, we use the scope 1 emission, which are the direct emissions that controlled or owned by the company. That is because we expect the green technologies should reduce the direct emissions of the company rather than the indirect emission. So we do not use scope 2 or scope 3 emission. Here it's our first stage regression result. As just here, we find a positive and significant interaction term, which is consistent with our expectation. So the result indicates the firms that highly exposed to litigation risk experience a greater increase in the green patenting activities after the legal change, after the reduction of litigation risk. So I hope this parallel trend assumption could provide a more intuitive explanation. So the each dot in this figure represents the relative behavior of the high exposed and the low exposed firms in our test sample. So here we can say the vertical red line, it's a baseline year in 2006, the legal change, the eBay case decision year. So it appears that after the case decision, it's appears to have an increasing trend in the green patterning activities for the high exposed companies relative to the low exposed companies, sorry. So it's consistent with the first stage regression results. After that, we can move to the second stage regression, which is our baseline findings, actually. So as highlighted here, we find a positive and significant coefficient for all of these three different measures of green innovation, which is consistent with our expectation. So firms with more green pattern stocks increase their incentives to disclose CO2 emissions voluntarily in the following year. So that is our baseline finding, confirm that green innovation, green technologies increase firms' incentives to disclose voluntarily. And here it's an argument that the general class patterns or the non-green patterns might also affect the carbon disclosure decision. But we would not expect that is the case. So we generate a placebo test to examine this argument. So in particular, we create a placebo sample of firms which are patterning in the United States, but do not have green patterns during the sample period, and just replicate these two-stage regressions with this placebo sample of firms. Well, finally, we do not find any significant result, which means the improvement in technologies that irrelevant to CO2 reduction have no contribution to the corporate carbon disclosure decisions. It further confirmed the robustness of our baseline finding that only the technologies could contribute to firms' environmental performance, could increase firms' incentives to disclose. So that is a placebo test. The next step, we expand our baseline finding by considering the heterogeneity across industries and across firms. So it comes with two cross-sectional analysis. Firstly, we consider the impact on high-emitting industries, because these high-emitting industries usually with strict public eyes to reduce emissions, and therefore we would expect this kind of industries have stronger incentives to disclose emissions when they have positive news on emissions. Well, secondly, we try to test the role of preparatory cost of disclosure, and we use market competition to stand for the preparatory cost. And finally, we find the impact of green pattern stock on the carbon disclosure decision is more silent in high-emitting industry, but less pronounced for firms with a higher preparatory cost of disclosure. And finally, we can conclude our studies from three different aspects. Firstly, firms with greater green pattern stocks are more likely to disclose their CO2 emissions voluntarily. And secondly, the impact is stronger in high-emitting industries, but less pronounced for firms with a higher preparatory cost of disclosure. And finally, in a bigger picture, we would say that green innovation plays an enabling role in signaling firms' ability to the climate risk adaptation. So that's all. Thanks so much for your listening.